you pose the central question of the book as follows. What happens, this is my phrase, to the little guy and their foundational freedoms, like the right to speak, the right to pray, the right to gather freely, when our laws increasingly restrict what we may say, they monitor what we do, and tell us how we may live? And you write in the book about how rich people, people with connections, or popular people, they'll do okay. If you look at history, it's when the unpopular or unconnected, unwealthy guy or gal gets dragged into the courts that all of this regulation becomes a problem. And you feature front and foremost the story of Sandra and John Yates. I told my family the story. We're still talking about it. Even my kids were completely baffled by what happened to John Yates. Can you outline it for us quickly?
Sure. So John and Sandra Yates are high school sweethearts. They moved to Florida. He pursued his life's dream of becoming a commercial fisherman, worked his way up from deckhand to captain of his own small crew. And he's out one day. Somebody comes alongside, flashes a badge and says, "I'd like to measure your fish." John says, "Well, we've been out for some time and I've got thousands of pounds of red grouper in the hold." He says, "Fine, I got all day." And he sits there measuring the red grouper one by one. And he determines that there are 72 fish that are less than 20 inches long, the limit at the time. Now, John's not convinced this fellow knows how to measure red grouper because he doesn't account for their long lower jaw like he should. But put that aside, 72 it is. The agent says, "Put those in a crate and I'll deal with you when you get back to dock in a few days." John does that. Well, when he gets back, the agent measures them again and finds 69 now, not 72, that are undersized, and he's suspicious. But John doesn't hear anything more about it for 3 years when a group of agents surround his house, his wife's doing the laundry, and arrest him, take him 2 hours away. He has no idea what this is about. And he's charged with a violation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was, as you know, adopted after the Enron accounting scandal. And it's designed to prevent people from destroying documents when there's a federal investigation. But the law reads, you can't destroy things like accounting records and spreadsheets and other tangible objects. And the government's Sarbanes-Oxley theory is that John had thrown overboard 72 undersized red grouper and replaced them with 69 still undersized red grouper. And John thought that was about the silliest thing he'd ever heard. But they pursued the case even after the size limit for red grouper was dropped to 18 inches, and all of his fish, by anyone's estimation, were longer than that. They spent years pursuing him, secured a conviction. He spent 30 days in jail over Christmas when he and his wife were trying to raise 2 young grandchildren. And he was ready to give up. He was done. And Sandra said, "No, we have to fight this for the next person so it doesn't happen to someone else again." She took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court and won by a single vote. Now, that kind of spirit I admire, but look at the costs that it came to that family. John was no longer able to pursue his life's dream as a commercial fisherman, put out of work. His wife now supports the family, and they live in a trailer. So that's the human toll of too much law, right? And you know, it's something that's happened in my lifetime, Megyn. I don't know about yours, but our laws have just simply exploded. The federal criminal code is more than doubled in my lifetime in length. There are so many federal crimes now in regulatory provisions that nobody can be sure because it would take years just to read them. There are at least 300,000, we know. And, you know, everybody says Congress isn't busy. They write 2 to 3 million new words of statutory law every year. And the federal regulations, forget about Congress. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The Federal Register used to be 16 pages long when it started in the 1930s. Now, every year, we see 60 to 70,000 pages added annually.
This John's wife, Sandra, is really the heroine of the book.
I agree.
She brought this case, notwithstanding the enormous challenges to doing that when you don't have a lot of money. As you point out, it lasted 8 years, 3 courts, 13 different judges. And John was forced to do the time and pay the price, even though he was ultimately successful at the U.S. Supreme Court. You point out in the book, all of this is very contrary to the founders' vision of what America would be about. And you say that one of the essential purposes in our founding documents, as recognized by Justice William O. Douglas, was to take government off the backs of the people and to keep it off. And somehow that's been turned on its head with the numbers that you just espoused, that by 100 years ago, all the federal government laws fit into a single volume. This is all from the book Overruled. By 2018, U.S. Code was 54 volumes, 60,000 pages. There are 300,000 federal agency regulations, many of which have criminal penalties, and on and on. It's just spun out of control to where no one could ever understand what all the laws are out there and how many we violate in a day.
Yeah, some people say, some academics say that anyone over the age of 18 in this country could be charged with a federal felony. And that does raise a lot of questions in my mind, right? Our founders wanted for us written laws. They wrote a constitution. That was a novel idea in human history at the time. And it was designed to divide and check and balance power and make lawmaking difficult. We forget that. They saw law as restrictions on freedoms. And so they wanted lawmaking to be an especially difficult task. And that's why we have two houses of Congress, why you have to then get the president to sign it or override his veto. And we've kind of taken that process where we're supposed to have the wisdom of the masses, all the people involved, their representatives coming together, compromising, working through problems, and passing laws that we can all maybe understand and agree on. We've outsourced a lot of that work to federal agencies where there are experts and they have very important contributions to make, but there aren't the kinds of checks and balances that Madison had in mind for us.
Yeah, they're not elected. And as you point out in the book Overruled, they often not only will be the promulgators of these basically criminal statutes that we're going to have to abide by, but then they're the judge and jury too. They will create the regulation, they'll charge us with violating it, and then they'll try the case, and surprise, surprise, they're not the most objective judge.
Well, when Janie and I sat down to work on the book, we wondered how many federal agencies there are, Megyn. And it turns out federal agencies can't agree on how many federal agencies exist. There are at least 3 different published numbers of how many of them there are. And you're right, they write rules, very important work. They prosecute people for violations of those rules. And then in many cases, they serve as the judge for the case too. Jonathan Turley, professor at George Washington, says that the average American is 10 times more likely to be brought before one of these administrative judges. They used to be called hearing officers, but now they call themselves administrative judges. Great. Than an American is likely to ever face a judge and a jury. And what's at stake there? Why do we care about this? Why do we write about this in the book? Well, when you're before a judge, you're before somebody who is pretty independent, who's been appointed and confirmed and been through that process, but after that doesn't owe anything to anybody, right? His only job or her job is to apply the law as faithfully and fairly as they can. And you have a jury of your peers to decide your case. Before an agency, your administrative judge or administrative law judge is likely to be somebody who works for the very same agency that's bringing the charges against you. You're not going to have a jury. And many of the procedures that you'd get in court, including basic rights like cross-examination, are not always given to you the way they would be in court. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very different system. And it's unsurprising as a result that agencies almost always win before their own judges in ways that they wouldn't win in court.
That fierce independence of the judiciary is going to come back into this discussion as we get into some of the criticisms of the courts these days and the push to make them more accountable, and whether that's also inconsistent with the founders' vision. You you do an excellent job of outlining the problem in terms of the volume of law, the impossibility of understanding the laws, real man and women stories of how it's impossible to navigate the system and how people have gotten caught in this web. But I do want to tick through a couple of the passing references because they bring it home. Justice Gorsuch goes through the 6-year-old you may have heard of who landed in court for picking a tulip by the bus stop, 10-year-old whose lemonade stand was shuttered for lack of a business license. We talked about those kids all the time when I was on Fox. It's a federal crime to enter a post office while intoxicated. There goes my Saturday night. To sell a mattress without a warning label. I never knew that was real. We all rip those off of our mattresses thinking that's a joke. To injure a government-owned lamp in D.C. and, absurdly, to consult with a known pirate, which is right on point. Who spends their time coming up with this stuff, never mind enforcing it?
Well, that's the thing. I used to think those were like stray anecdotes. And then I started seeing them in my courtroom. When I was a 10th Circuit judge, I had a case, I think it was a 7th grader, certainly a middle schooler, who was trading burps for laughs in his classroom. And I might have been guilty of that in the day. And instead of being just taken to the principal's office, or maybe his parents called, or maybe detention, he was arrested and handcuffed. And it went to court. Now, I don't know what's happening in our society that leads to things like that. Another one, a small healthcare company in Kansas was accused of Medicare fraud. Big deal. That's the kind of thing that can put your company out of business. And it went through 6 years of those kinds of administrative law proceedings we talked about a moment ago, got to my court. And the three of us, we sit in panels of 3 on the courts of appeals usually. We looked at each other and said, I think they complied with all the rules that were in existence at the time they provided their services. And the government's accusing them of violating rules that it didn't even promulgate until years after they provided the services. Are we missing something? And we got the government lawyer in front of us and heard argument. And it turned out the government had just become confused. It was producing so many rules so fast. It had no idea that it was accusing somebody for violating rules that didn't even exist at the time.
If you're tired of the same old coffee from those mega corporations pushing their woke agendas, listen up. It's time to take a stand and support a brand that embodies American values. At Blackout Coffee, they stand with hardworking Americans who believe in family, faith, and freedom. They roast some of the most incredible coffee you will ever taste using only premium grade beans. And guess what? They roast and ship within 48 hours. And that ensures that you get the freshest coffee possible. You could start your day with a bold cup of Blackout coffee and be delighted just like yours truly. Plus, it's not just coffee, it's a statement. Why settle for less? Make the switch to Blackout Coffee today by heading over to blackoutcoffee.com/MK or just use the code MK for 20% off your first order. That's blackoutcoffee.com/MK and the code is MK. Join the movement. Taste the difference. Remember, with every sip, you're supporting a brand that stands for America. Be awake, not woke. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.